Quite often, I get people in my streams complimenting my tracking quality, saying that they have never seen anything like that, and then asking how they could get something similar. Now, sadly, up until this point, the answer has pretty much been that they cannot, because I have been using my custom homemade solution to do all the tracking systems. However, the most recent version of VNyan is finally adding that tracking system available to all the users of VNyan as well. So now you can also get that high quality tracking that I have been using for all these years. Hi, it's your friendly neighborhood VTuber Suvi here, again with a new tutorial. Today, we're going to look into VNyan's new SteamVR tracking support and how you can easily, or with little effort, start to use it on your own streams as well. This system is recommended for lighthouse trackers. So if you are using IMU trackers like SlimeVR or Unimotion or anything like that, then I do recommend you do your tracking still through like SlimeVR server and then send it through VMC protocol to VNyan. But if you use lighthouse trackers such as Vive trackers or Tundra trackers, then this is highly recommended way to do it then. So for this to work, you will need VNyan 1.5 version. And then, of course, you will need your trackers. So let's get started with the tutorial then, shall we? The very first step for you, of course, when setting this up is to load up your 3D model in VNyan. And also do connect SteamVR and power up all your trackers before you get started with this process. So first of all, we are going to go to the settings. And now if you have never used VNyan before, or even if you have used it before, you will want to make sure that you do not use any camera trackers that will override the tracking. So if you're using a camera tracking, make sure to set all these apply values to 0. And then for the 𝐒𝐻𝐋𝐿 tracking, so the phone tracking, if you use that, then also make sure to set all these apply sliders to 0, because these will override your VR tracking. They're always applied on top of VR. Now, you will of course be able to combine face tracking from phone tracking. That will work just fine. You just need to remember to track the blend shapes. Okay. And then if you use leap motion, well, you might want to turn it off when you're initially setting things up. So then we have the SteamVR tracking in the tracking layers. First thing is to click on the SteamVR tracking. This will start the tracking process. So just click that on. Your character will probably fall to the floor when you do that, because that indicates the trackers are not yet connected. So if you zoom out, you should see your character in some weird pose. Nothing to be alarmed about though. So the first step for you then is to map the trackers. So let's open up the tracker mapping window. Now, first of all, in this window, you will see a slot selection. There are a total of 69 tracker mapping slots that you can assign in VNyan. This means that you can do various kinds of combinations of trackers, depending on what you happen to be using the tracking for. You could have one set up for VR chat or VR games, and then you could have another setup for your normal just chatting streams, or maybe you have a different setup for when you're sitting down and just wanting to VR track your upper body. There are many options. Anyway, we're just going to set up the slot number 1. You will see the recommended positions for the trackers. In this case, we are recommending that you use a Vive tracker or a Tundra tracker for your head tracking instead of a headset. You will be able to use a headset, of course, if you are wanting to calibrate this for a VR game. Now, the positions, of course, are only recommendations. You can also wear the trackers in different places. For example, quite many do wear the leg trackers around their leg rather than their calf. And then, of course, underneath the tracking settings, we have some other settings that you can turn on. For example, we can adjust the tracking space rotation, the tracking space height. We can also mirror the tracking and also decide what parts to track. But these are more advanced settings that we don't really need to touch right now. So let's go and first assign the tracker. So make sure all your trackers are powered on, and then just click on the search icon next to the text box. This will bring you a list of your currently connected trackers. Now you can start moving your tracker around and it will light up in green. This indicates that the specific tracker is being moved. So you can select that, and now as we can see, our head is already linked right away. Now we need to repeat this, of course, for all the other things. So first, let's set up a simple 3-point tracking. So we will only connect head tracker, and then we are going to connect index controllers to use as the hand trackers. So let's go with the left hand first. Move that around and we see it's this one. And then we'll do the same for the right hand. And there we go. Now we have 3 trackers connected. And we could, of course, already see some kind of movement happening here. As you can see, things look kind of wrong currently. This is because we haven't calibrated yet or set up the avatar yet. So what you want to do next is, of course, put on the trackers if you haven't done that yet. Okay, so we have our trackers on right now. Now, as we can see in our default orientation, our character is already facing the wrong way. So we could obviously change this simply by adjusting the tracking space orientation. So we could rotate the tracking space so that we are facing the camera, like so. Now, you don't, of course, need to do this. You could also rotate the camera around, but in many cases, maybe you have already set up your VNyan setup so that it is facing certain direction, so it's going to be easier to just fix the tracking space. Okay, so the next step for us is to calibrate our avatar. As you can already see, the avatar is kind of working, but we have certain things that we obviously need to fix. Now, when you're using only 3 trackers, so a head tracker and then hand trackers, most of the time things will work just fine. But when you add more trackers like leg trackers, elbow trackers, hip tracker, etc., then you more than likely will have to calibrate every time you put on the tracker, since there will be slight variation in the way you happen to be putting the trackers on you. So let's go to the calibration settings next. Or first, we're actually going to click the Show Offsets button. What this Show Offsets does, it actually shows currently the offsetted tracker positions. Now, there are many boxes you see here that are not moving. Those are just reserved for the kind of unconnected trackers, so just don't pay them any mind right now. Let's go to the tracker or the calibration settings next. Now, this may look a bit complex when you open it the first time. Basically, we will again have calibration slots, 69 of them. And then we will have plenty of other settings here. You will see lots of offset settings and lots of altitude adjustment settings. Now, these are for fine-tuning your trackers. And in most cases, you do not need to touch the actual offset adjustments. The only things you will probably want to adjust are the altitude adjustment sliders. The first thing you will want to do while you're in this view is simply click Calibrate. Before you touch any of the values, do an initial calibration. Now, the calibration will tell you to assume a T-pose, and then you can either wait or click the buttons. And this will already probably give you a result that you may be happy with if you're using the 3-point tracking. Now, we can already see, of course, from this that our avatar has slightly crouched legs. This may not always be the result you want. So, what we can, of course, do next is we can start adjusting these values. So we could, for example, you should always start with the head. So adjust your head to an altitude you kind of like. I do recommend you don't make it so high that your legs are completely straight, because then the movement can look a little bit weird. So keep it so that your legs have a small bend in them, something like this. Like so. And now you have something like 0.05. In this case, in your case, it might be negative value or it might be positive, depending on your avatar's height. Keep this value in mind, because you may need something similar for the next value. The next value is the arm altitude. Now this adjusts the arm tracker altitude. And the best way to test this is put your hand in a T-pose, and then you can move this around, and as you can see, your arm moves around. So you want to set it to a value where your hand is pretty much in a T-pose. Usually it's the same amount as you would have for the head tracker, but it can also have a small variance. And now our settings would already be ready for this 3-point tracking. Of course, things get a bit more complicated once we have more trackers added. But now would probably be a good time to also explain these calibration slots. Why do we have so many different calibration slots? The thing with VNyan is that we do not apply transformation or translation between several models when it comes to the calibration. Instead, we want to give the user the opportunity and possibility to manually adjust and configure each model they have so that the tracking will be perfect, rather than trusting some algorithm to do it for you completely. So, in most cases, you will only need one calibration slot. However, if you use models that have different rigs, then you may have to create multiple calibration slots. Like if your model is totally different, let's say you have a chibi model, or you have a custom model and then you have a Vroid model or something that have different proportions, then it is recommended you create a different calibration slot for the different model. And then whenever you load a model, you can also call the node graph to swap to a different calibration slot to instantly have the perfect tracking for your model. Now do not worry, you only will need to calibrate one model when you start VNyan. Also, this setting that we are doing right now is something you will only need to do once. You will not need to adjust these offsets every single time you use this application. It will remember the values. So in general, when you launch VNyan, if your tracker orientations have changed, all you really need to do is click the calibrate once, and it will calibrate automatically all the calibration slots for all the models you have set up. Since we have now gone through the very initial setup, we could probably start adding more trackers to our tracking mapping next. So let's go to the tracker mapping setting next and start adding some trackers. Now, as you probably noticed, 3 trackers are the minimum to use VNyan. And then there are certain priorities for trackers, and certain trackers that are not even recommended to be used. For example, the upper chest and the knee trackers are not really recommended starting points, so you should leave those to be the last, if at all you should even use them. So which tracker should we add next if we already have head and hands? If you are only doing upper body tracking, then I would recommend the next trackers to be elbows, because that will increase quality. And if you are planning on starting to increase full body tracking, then you will need a hip tracker and then the feet trackers. So to get started, let's start with the hip trackers first. So we're again going to have to repeat the assignment thing, so just click the hip tracker here, move it around and select it. You can of course wear the hip tracker already in place, and then you will want to repeat that for the foot trackers as well. Okay, so right now we have added 3 more trackers to our setup. So we have 6-point tracking going on. So what do we do next? We could either already add the elbow trackers, or we could first configure this. So let's just go configure our calibration next. So we will be using the same slot this time. And again, to get started, you should do the initial calibration. Now you do already have these altitude values here. You may not actually need to change them anymore. So let's do an initial calibration again. Like so. And now you can already see the tracking is working to some degree. And we can see that our feet are moving. Our waist is somewhat moving. There is some weirdness with the body, so we will have to adjust the values a little bit. So let's go to the calibration settings again. And we're going to have to adjust the values a bit. So we can already see that our head is basically at correct altitude. Our feet trackers may be slightly off. This may be due to calibration, so recalibrating may in fact solve the feet altitude issue. So make sure your trackers are not blocked by any obstacles when you calibrate. Okay, that's already much better. So now how do we fix the hip issue? First of all, let's move down a little bit until we find the pelvis altitude from here. Now, oftentimes, depending on the structure of your model, you may actually have to drop the pelvis tracker down a little bit. Now, you will see the box move there. Do not move it too much, like only very small amount, so that it is still kind of between your legs very high up. This makes it so that whenever you do certain kind of movements, there will not be any kind of weird flinching in the body. Usually the best way to test is by just, bending over a little bit and see if you have some weird snapping of your torso when it happens. Now, as you can see, the movement does actually look pretty nice already, so there is not really much need to do anything about that. Now we do, of course, again have the knee bend here. It may be a little bit more noticeable right now than it was before. So you may also have to adjust the altitude a little bit. Now, of course, a good test in this case is to load a world that has a floor. So you can more easily tell, is your character actually standing on ground or not. VNyan comes with a very good world for this. You can try the stage world that actually does have a floor at the correct altitude. So let's load that and see how things look. Okay, now we have the world loaded. So we can take a look. Is our avatar actually standing on floor? Now you can of course hide the offsets while you do this. And based on this, our character is actually standing on floor. So we do not need to adjust our leg offsets at all. Now in some cases, you may have to actually adjust the feet altitude. If your feet are not on floor, you may need to adjust this slider. Now keep in mind, if you have to move it down, then you may need to bring your head down as well a little bit to make up for the movement here. But in our case, we don't actually need to do anything for this. Now you could, of course, if you don't like this much of a bend in full body tracking, you could always increase the head height a little bit more, like so. And then things should work. Now, of course, in certain movements, you may see the knees kind of reach their maximum bending limit, which may cause a bit weird effect if you don't like it. So in that reason, you may want to basically keep a small bend for the knees. Okay, so now we basically have our full body tracking connected. And now, of course, you can improve this by adding more trackers to your setup. However, there are some things you need to keep in mind with the remaining tracking slots that we have. They are all working in a different way. So they are not like exact tracking goals, but they are bending targets. So they don't exactly force bones to their position. They will only decide the orientation. Now this may sound a bit complicated, but we could test this, for example, with our upper chest tracker. Now the upper chest tracker will only move around the y-axis. And this is based, of course, on the position of the tracker. So if we make the offset visible, you will see that the cube is not visible right now, which means that we will have to calibrate. So put your tracker in place first and then do the initial calibration for your upper chest. Okay, now we have our upper chest calibrated, but as you can see, there is some really weird movement right now. This is because the offset is very much wrong. In my case, you can see the tracker go all around. That is because it is getting basically blocked by obstacles in the room. So this is one reason why I would advise against using it, because you may have it in a completely incorrect position. Now, if you do not have anything blocking it though, then you may have better luck. Let's try calibrating again. Okay, so now we have the tracker physically behind the character, but as you can see, it is actually flipped and it shows up in front. But this is actually a very good position for it. So we want the tracker to always be in front of our avatar, because this will basically decide the position or direction our upper body will be facing along the y-axis. So if your tracker is behind you, or the box is behind you, then you will have to adjust the upper torso offsets. So then we will find this upper chest tracker adjustment, and we can adjust this Z value to decide where the upper torso tracker is. So make sure it is always in front of you, and it does not need to be all that near, because obviously if it is close, then during certain kind of movements you may get very weird looking result. So now we have one additional tracker added to the setup. The upper torso is probably the most difficult of these trackers to set up correctly. In most cases, I would recommend you do not use it, because it doesn't really add much to the quality. On the contrary, it may actually lower the quality of your tracking. The only reason where you might want to use it is if you do some kind of VR dancing and you absolutely need that tracker. But do be prepared to spend a lot of time setting it up, because finding the perfect spot is going to take a while. Anyway, the elbow trackers are much easier to set up. With elbows, you do not in many cases need to adjust the offsets at all either. So just put them in place and connect. Knees, on the other hand, are going to require similar kind of calibration as the upper chest. So you will have to make sure that the knee boxes are in front of your knees. Now, sadly, I do not have knee straps, so right now I cannot showcase that, but the use case is basically identical. You will need to want the boxes to be in front of your knees. Now, again, the knee trackers don't really add that much to the quality, because your leg rotation is basically calculated from your feet trackers. And especially if you wear your trackers around your calf, there isn't really that much rotational difference. Now, if you wear your trackers around your legs, then there might be, and in that case, using the knee trackers may be justified. If you are using something way different than what I've been using during the stream today, let's say you don't actually have index controllers, but you are using tracking gloves and you're combining them with, let's say, a Vive tracker, then your arm tracker position may of course be different. So in this case, you would obviously have to adjust the offsets for your hand trackers. So in this case, we could, for example, adjust the hand trackers around a little bit. So let's say if we were to move the right hand. So if we had, for example, a wrist tracker instead of a hand controller, we might need to move the offsets a little bit. Maybe closer to the hand. This could be moved by adjusting the X value. So usually it's best that you have your hand somehow visible and then you start moving this. Now, if you're trying to figure out the location, you can do this kind of nyan movement. And you want to check that your arm is actually moving the correct way. So of course, in this case, because we're using a controller, the values are already good. But if you were using a wrist tracker, your hand might actually look like this. So you will want to adjust, of course, the calibration so that it looks more correct. And of course, that it doesn't go way beyond what it should be. Now, in many cases, you may also have to adjust the Y value if your tracker is sitting on top of your palm or something. So this will help counter that as well. So it may take a while to find the perfect offsets if you use something different from what is the recommended build. But it's all very much doable and you have full control over what is going to happen. You are obviously not limited to just using body trackers, but you can also track props in VNyan. Now, tracking props in VNyan is a little bit more complex because that part hasn't really been yet redone for this SteamVR system. So we're using the same method we used for the old VMC trackers. So the first thing you would want to do is figure out which tracker you're moving. We do not have this moving detection yet in the other UI, so the best way to test a moving tracker is to use this tracker mapping slot. Just pick any of the empty slots, move a tracker around, and memorize its number. Usually you can just memorize the last two letters of the code. So in this case, we see A3. So we will keep that in mind then. Next stuff is that we go to the monitor. And this will list us at the very bottom. We see all received VMC trackers. Now, even though we are not receiving this data through VMC, we will still list all the trackers in here. So when you find this specific code from this list, so the A3, you can click that, and that will copy the name of it to the clipboard. And this will make it much easier to assign the tracker. So next step is go to the tracking settings again and scroll to the very bottom of the tracking settings. And you see here VMC tracker mapping. Now just open that window and you will see a small dialog where you can assign total of 32 trackers or tracking slots. So we can click just tracker 1. If you haven't used any of this, just click the first one and then enter the serial number. Now you can just paste it from the clipboard like so. And now we have assigned it to tracker 1. So now if we go to the props and we have any kind of prop here, for example, in this case, we have a cat face.png. Now in the linked bone, we can simply select tracker 1 from the list. So all those tracking slots are listed here as a linked bone. So now when we select it to this one, and then we make this prop visible, now you should see the thingy here. And as you move the tracker around, let me actually grab it to this hand, then you will see that the prop is moving. So now you could, for example, use this to track a computer chair or a microphone, possibly even a water cup, or wherever you want to stick a Vive tracker to. You can basically make it trackable. You could even track your cat if you want to. It's completely up to you. So go crazy with all the trackers at that point. Okay, so the next step then. There are plenty of new nodes that this VR tracking support has given us as well. So if we go to the node graph and we start searching for Steam, then we will find all the new SteamVR nodes. And as you can see, there are quite many of them. First of all, we have a node for swapping a calibration slot, which will allow you to swap to one of the 69 calibration slots. This is useful if you are using multiple avatars, as mentioned before, and you calibrate multiple avatars for the calibration slot, so you can then swap to a different slot when you swap to a different model. In the same manner, there is a tracker mapping slot selector. So if you want to swap your tracker modes during your stream, let's say you use some trackers that run out of battery during your stream. Like in my case, my elbow trackers are always running out during streams. So I usually disconnect the elbow trackers. So in my case, I use two tracker mapping settings, one with elbows and one without elbows. So I can simply swap to a different mapping when those trackers or one of them starts to die. Now, in addition to this, we do have a calibration node. This can either open up the calibration dialog or it can do an instant calibration. Now, the instant calibration means that you need to be in a T-pose when you call that node. So you could link it to, for example, your controller buttons or something if you wanted an instant calibration. In most cases, you do not need this functionality more than once per stream, but maybe if you use something else than Lighthouse trackers, then you may need some way to initiate the calibration more easily. And then finally, we have a filter node that detects buttons. Now, this mostly supports the index controllers, but some Oculus Touch or Meta Touch controllers should also work. You may have to set the controller mapping in Steam if it doesn't get detected by default. But here you can basically check if a button is pressed. So you could make a loop, for example, a timer loop that checks a button status to do something. Let's say if you wanted to wiggle your character's ears when you click a button, that would be possible. Or if you wanted to control your camera with the buttons, that would also be very much doable this way. So as you saw, it may take a while to do the initial configuration for VNyan, but after you have set the trackers and calibration slots up once, you do not have to touch them again. Most of the time, all you need to do is do one initial calibration when you launch up the application, and this only if your tracker positions have changed. If you wear your trackers always the same way, then you may never need to calibrate again. One calibration may just be enough for you. So, if you use only 3 trackers, you may only have to calibrate once. But we'll see. Good luck anyway. Now, if you do run into any trouble setting up the offsets and so on, make sure you join our Discord if you're not there yet and just ask help there, because there are plenty of our new VNyan ambassadors and of course other members of the community who can help you solve your problems really quickly as well. Anyway, cuties, see you next time. Happy VR tracking. Bye bye.